Ever think about what's really going on deep down inside your car's engine, like right at the heart of it all? Today, we're diving deep into one of those unsung heroes, a component so crucial it's mind boggling. Piston rings. Yeah, piston rings. These little guys, they're the workhorses, making sure your car moves, squeezing out every bit of power, keeping things running smooth, and even, believe it or not, playing a role in those emissions we're all trying to cut down.
Absolutely. The piston ring assembly might seem simple at first glance, but trust me, it's anything but. We're talking about an intricate system that has to handle incredible pressure from combustion, manage the oil that keeps the engine from seizing up, help keep things cool, and even contribute to a quieter ride. And with all the emphasis these days on reducing CO2 and, well, all those nasty emissions, getting the absolute most out of these rings is more important than ever.
So, for this deep dive, you brought in some really fascinating research. It's an experimental investigation, right? And it's focused on oil consumption and all those factors that mess with how well those piston rings actually do their job. What's really cool is they actually built a single cylinder engine just for this research. Talk about getting down to the nitty gritty.
That's exactly right. I mean, building a dedicated engine just for this purpose, it's like giving researchers this amazing opportunity to really get up close and personal with that piston ring assembly. They can implement some super precise measurement techniques that you just couldn't do otherwise. So, today our goal is to really dig into how these rings are actually moving around in there and what clever ways scientists have come up with to measure that movement. But, the most important part, at least for everyone listening out there, is understanding what impact all this movement has on how your engine performs in the real world. And we're going to be focusing specifically on what this particular research uncovered.
Okay, so let's start with the basics here. What are the main jobs of these piston rings? I mean, it sounds like they've got a lot on their plate, right?
Oh, they definitely do. It's a high-pressure job for sure. But at the core of it, piston rings have three primary roles. First, they've got to seal that combustion chamber. Imagine like a tiny explosion happening inside there. Those rings need to stop those super hot, high-pressure gases from sneaking past the piston and getting into the crankcase. That leakage, by the way, is called blow-by, and it's not good saps power from the engine and pumps up those emissions. But then they also need to stop oil from going the other way, from being sucked up into the combustion chamber, sometimes called reverse blow-by. Second big job, they're like oil control freaks. They make sure just the right amount of oil stays on the cylinder walls, enough to keep everything lubricated and prevent wear and tear. Too much oil, and it ends up burning in the combustion chamber. Too little? Well, you're looking at friction, damage, and a whole lot of trouble. And lastly, they help move some of that intense heat away from the piston, transferring it to the cooler cylinder wall.
Sounds like a tough balancing act. You want that super tight seal to contain all that power, but you don't want too much friction eating away at your efficiency.
You got it. That's one of the biggest challenges in engine design. The harder those rings press against the cylinder wall, the better the seal, sure. But that also means more friction. So engineers are always on the hunt for that sweet spot, where you get top-notch sealing without sacrificing power and fuel economy because of all that friction and wear.
Now, you mentioned blow-by earlier, something you hear about with older engines, maybe ones that aren't as efficient. How big of a deal is blow-by in, say, a modern car engine?
Well, while modern engines have come a long way in minimizing blow-by, it's still something to keep an eye on. Even a tiny bit of gas sneaking past those rings can have a noticeable impact on efficiency and bump up those nasty hydrocarbon emissions. That's why you see those crankcase ventilation systems. They actually route those gases back into the intake to be burned. Now, this research, it also digs into the issue of oil creeping into the combustion chamber. That can be a real headache, especially in those turbocharged engines, because it can lead to increased particulate emissions. It all boils down to this super intricate multi-stage sealing system where the piston and rings work together to keep things in check.
Okay, so these rings aren't just like sitting there static, right? They're moving around as the engine runs. What kinds of movement are we talking about and what's causing all this commotion?
There's actually a whole dance routine going on in there. So first up, you've got axial movement. This is the up and down movement of the rings within those grooves on the piston. Picture this. During the power stroke, when the combustion goes boom, the pressure pushes the rings down hard against the lower part of their grooves. That's how they make that tight seal we were talking about. But then, during the other parts of the engine cycle, inertia kicks in, and they move in the opposite direction. It's like they're bouncing ever so slightly in their little channels.
Okay, up and down, got it. But what about side to side against the cylinder wall itself?
Ah, that's radial movement. This is how those rings stay snuggle up against the cylinder wall, making that crucial contact. Now, here's something interesting. Some of that blow-by gas, the stuff that sneaks past, actually helps push the rings outwards, making sure they stay in contact. But this radial movement, it could be seriously affected by something called piston secondary motion.
Piston secondary motion. Can you break that down for me? It sounds complicated.
So it turns out the piston isn't just going straight up and down. As it moves, it also tilts and shifts a tiny bit from side to side within the cylinder. Imagine it's got a little wobble as it goes up and down. This secondary motion, it has a huge impact on how those rings sit against the cylinder wall. In fact, some studies have even seen something called radial collapse, where under really high pressure, a ring can actually momentarily lose contact with the wall.
Wow, wobbling and collapsing rings. It sounds like a pretty wild party going on in there. Is that all the movement they're doing?
You wish. There's more. You've also got twisting motion. Because of the way pressure is distributed and all the friction going on, the ring can actually twist a little within its groove. This twisting, it can affect how well the ring seals and how effectively it scrapes that oil off the cylinder wall. And last but not least, there's rotation. The rings can actually slowly spin around within their grooves. Now, this rotation, it's actually a good thing. It helps distribute wear and tear evenly around the whole ring. But this particular research found that significant ring rotation was pretty rare under normal driving conditions. It was more noticeable when the engine was being turned over without actually burning fuel, what they call motored operation, with the throttle closed.
So this piston secondary motion, that side-to-side wobble, it sounds like it's really throwing a wrench in the works for those rings. How much of an impact does it actually have?
It's a big deal, honestly. As the piston tilts and shifts, it really messes with how the rings are behaving. It affects the way the oil film spreads out on the cylinder wall, and it can even force oil up into the ring grooves, which can lead to, yep, you guess it, more oil consumption. And they even mentioned this thing called tertiary motion in the research, which is movement in the direction of the crankshaft. That plays a role, too. It's not just a simple up and down motion. It's a whole lot more going on in there.
And all this movement, it's happening super fast under crazy pressure and heat. How in the world do researchers even measure these tiny movements in such an extreme environment?
That's where the real ingenuity comes in. They've come up with some seriously clever techniques. Let's start with how they measure axial movement, that up and down motion in the groove.
I mean, I can barely even see these things, let alone try to measure how they're moving while the engine's firing away.
Right, so they often use these non-contact methods, things like inductive proximity sensors. Basically, these sensors can tell how far away they are from a metal object, the piston ring, in this case without actually touching it. So by carefully positioning these tiny sensors near the ring grooves, scientists can track the ring's up and down movement. But as you can imagine, it's not easy. That piston secondary motion can mess with the readings, and just getting those delicate sensors installed in such a tight spot is a feat in itself. The researchers in this study, they highlight how they successfully measured the axial movement of the first compression ring using these specially modified sensors.
Talk about delicate work. What about radial movement, how the rings are touching the cylinder wall and the thickness of that oil film?
For that, they often use this really neat trick called laser-induced fluorescence, or LIF. It's a mouthful, but it's pretty cool. They add a special fluorescent dye to the engine oil. Then they shine a laser beam on the spot they want to measure. That dye absorbs the laser light and then emits light at a different wavelength. That's the fluorescence part. And the intensity of that fluorescent light, it tells you exactly how thick the oil film is.
So brighter glow, thicker oil.
Exactly. And there are different ways to do this. Some setups use little glass windows or even a section as a glass cylinder liner. This allows the laser beam to get to the oil film, and the fluorescent light can be picked up by sensors outside the engine. Other methods use optical fibers embedded in the cylinder wall or even built right into the piston. Each approach has its pros and cons depending on what we're trying to measure. They also mentioned in the research that some studies even use tiny inductive or capacitive sensors built right into the rings themselves to measure that teeny tiny gap where the oil is.
Wow, so how do they track the rotation of these rings? That seems almost impossible.
This research, they used a pretty sophisticated method called radioisotope tracking. Basically, they put tiny amounts of radioactive isotopes into the piston rings. Each isotope emits a specific type of gamma radiation. Then they have sensors all around the engine that detect these gamma rays. And by analyzing the specific energy and intensity of a radiation, they can figure out exactly where each ring is pointing. They can even use different isotopes for multiple rings at the same time.
Now, that's some serious high-tech stuff. Are there challenges using radioactive materials in an engine like that?
Oh, definitely. It requires very careful handling and precise calibration. And the strength of the radiation signal depends on the distance to the sensor, so you have to account for that very carefully. They mentioned using a germanium detector, which is great at distinguishing between different energy levels of gamma rays, so you can tell the isotopes apart, but it might not capture every single emission. For bigger engines, researchers have also tried other things like looking at slight temperature changes on the rings or even using tiny optical sensors in the ring grooves.
Okay, so we've got all this movement going on, and we've got these super advanced ways to measure it, but what does all this tell us about how the engine is actually running? What's the real-world impact?
The way those piston rings move, it has huge consequences for how well the engine runs, particularly when it comes to oil consumption and blow-by. Those are two things you really don't want too much of.
Let's talk about oil consumption first. I mean, we all know engines burn oil eventually, but how does the movement of these tiny rings contribute to that?
Well, if those rings aren't making a perfect seal, or if their movement is pushing too much oil upwards, that oil can end up in the convection chamber and get burned up with the fuel. And all those oil transport mechanisms we talked about, those are the main culprits. It's like a game of oil limbo. How low can you go? Oil can evaporate from that thin film on the cylinder wall just from the sheer heat. The piston itself can scrape oil up, especially on the side opposite the connecting rod. Oil can get flung off the fast-moving piston at the top and bottom of its stroke. And then there's reverse blow-by, which can literally suck oil mist up past the rings.
So, this research, did it tell us which of these oil consumption culprits are the worst offenders?
Yeah, they found that in their setup, oil transport, meaning the oil being thrown off the piston and reverse blow-by, those were the biggest factors in oil consumption. And they saw that different engine speeds and loads had different effects on these mechanisms. It's interesting, though, because some other studies have said that the alignment of the gaps in the different compression rings is a major factor in oil consumption. But this particular research didn't see a clear link there, at least not in burr oil conditions.
Okay, what about blow-by? How does all this ring movement affect how much combustion gas escapes?
If those rings aren't sealing properly, actually and radially, you're going to have more blow-by. If they're not snug against the cylinder wall and the sides of their grooves, those high-pressure gases will find a way to escape. And that twisted motion we talked about, even the shape of the ring grooves themselves, they all play a part in keeping that seal tight. And here's the thing. It's a vicious cycle. Too much blow-by can actually mess up the oil film on the cylinder wall, which can lead to hot spots, lack of lubrication, and even damage to the cylinder wall itself.
So we're talking more oil burning, less power, more emissions, and potentially even damage to the engine itself. Are there any other downsides to poor ring movement?
Yeah, a couple more things to think about. All that movement of the piston and rings and that oil film between them, it all contributes to how noisy the engine is. And then you've got wear and tear, all that rubbing between the rings and their grooves, especially when you get those piston slap events from the secondary motion. It causes wear on the sides of the rings and grooves. They call this secondary wear. And over time, it can really degrade how well those rings seal.
You know, this research you brought, it had some really detailed findings. Can you give us some of the highlights?
Yeah, absolutely. This study was packed with insights. The fact that they were able to use that radioisotope tracking method, that was a big deal. It gives them analyze where those top two compression ring gaps were in real time without having to fix the rings in place. That's a huge step forward in understanding how they behave under real-world conditions. They tested out different piston ring sets, too, and measured the pressure around the rings and the amount of blow-by to see how tweaks to the rings affected things.
And they also got a good look at that oil film, right?
Oh, yeah. They used laser-induced fluorescence to map out the thickness of the oil film in different spots, gave them a much clearer picture of how the oil was being distributed and managed by the rings and piston. They even had these light guides on the piston skirt, so they could actually see how that piston's secondary motion and the way the piston warped under all that heat and pressure were impacting oil consumption. They were taking measurements constantly as they changed the engine load, and they found something really interesting. Oil tended to build up in the piston ring assembly when the engine was being motored, turned over without actually firing. And they found that different ring designs could affect how much oil built up.
That's fascinating. Oil building up even when there's no combustion.
Exactly. And they confirmed that ring rotation was definitely more pronounced during that motored operation with a closed throttle. They saw that the top compression ring tended to move toward the non-thrust side of the cylinder under those conditions, and their LIF measurements showed that the rings were actually pushing oil ahead of them as they moved. So even the compression rings, which are mainly thought of as sealing rings, were also acting like oil scrapers. They also found that the oil film in the ringland areas, those little spaces between the rings on the piston, it wasn't always completely filled, and the thickness would fluctuate as the engine ran. And finally, they really emphasized that the piston's secondary motion and how much the piston expands because of heat are major factors in how wide those lubricating gaps are and how thick the oil film is on the piston skirt itself.
I mean, this really paints a picture of just how crazy and complex things are inside an engine. So, what's the big takeaway here from this deep dive into the world of piston rings?
The main thing to remember is just how complicated the piston ring assembly is and all the different things that affect how it works. We've seen how these rings are constantly moving, axially, radially, twisting, sometimes rotating, all because of those crazy pressures and forces inside the engine. And the technology they're using to measure all this, it's giving us a whole new understanding of things like oil consumption and blow-by. If we want to design better piston rings, rings that make engines more efficient and cleaner, we have to understand these movements.
It's incredible, really, how much engineering is packed into something so small. It makes you appreciate the balance between sealing, lubrication, and efficiency, all happening at a microscopic level. So I have to ask, what do you think is the next big thing in internal combustion engine tech? What's going to help us get even lower friction and oil consumption? It really is food for thought, isn't it? Thanks for taking us on this fascinating deep dive.
You're welcome.
And to everyone listening, thanks for joining us on the deep dive.